We're going to move on now to Simon Rofe, who is going to be talking about the value of building online communities to provide quality learning experiences for students, not just through COVID, as we're all grappling with now, but beyond. So, Simon, if you're ready.
What I would like to do is talk to the value of online learning communities and what we're going to see as our sort of immediate future. I think the opportunity of making sure that our students have a quality learning experience in an online environment is something that we need to have and be integral to our work moving forward. What we face here is a situation in the pivot to online and through the challenges that we have to recognise that students have expectations in their learning. And as Diana just said, much of the learning that we are sharing is not something that takes place in our classrooms. We know that the informal conversations that students have at the end of lectures, the corridor conversations while waiting to get in and out of rooms, can often be really important learning perspectives, not least because students are brought together with their peers in a way that they might not be able to do otherwise. So looking at the online environment, it seems we have our slides now. Mark, would you be kind enough to just shuffle forward in the slide pack? What we have in this opportunity is the recognition that students are learning in many different ways, not just from the taught syllabus. So, building an online community is not just about having, this online facility, whether it's through, desktop or through, a device. It's all about being able to make sure that students connect with each other. And this is where sort of my own heritage in studying diplomacy really comes to the fore, in recognising the different networks that are placed here. And there's a vast body of literature looking at network analysis of what are the connections that are meaningful in people's lives, particularly in this case in learning, but also in other forms of societal connection. So the point, or the thesis to test here, and one that I was engaged with before we faced the traumas of COVID-19 in 2020, was that student performance, engagement and retention is enhanced by the use of online learning communities. So to jump to the conclusions, Mark, thank you. The point that I would make is that this is a opportunity to be enhanced through learning communities before, during and after, if we get to after, COVID-19. The online learning communities allow students to go beyond their immediate context, and this is really the substantial point here. It means that students can make connections and have conversations that they wouldn't have otherwise. If we think of not only the things that they might be, as it were, missing out on, not being in a tutorial of 12 people in one room on a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, for example, but actually that means they're not talking to the rest of their entire cohort, whether that's 100 students on one course or thousands on another. By putting them into an online learning community, as Diana described through some of the pyramiding or scaffolding, you actually expose students potentially to a far greater number of different opinions and peers, and potentially you're able to mix it up more easily. You're not stuck with that same group of 12 every Tuesday. It could be a different group by the time you meet, as it were, next week or in the next time constrained opportunity. And I think this is where actually utilising online learning communities, whatever the function, whatever the technology, actually is an enhancement to our practice as teachers in higher education, regardless of whether we're looking at the immediacy of the online environment or potentially as we assimilate back into a blended campus-based provision. And therefore, online is just a prefix. And I think, to colleagues who are coming to this afresh and to colleagues who are either befuddled by some of the technology, concerned by the fact that there's a whole part of a university or an institution or an industry that they weren't connected with, the online folks who do stuff over there, somewhere outside in a different part of the institution. But actually, don't fixate on that, fixate on the learning. And here I think and again, to pick up on some of Diane's points, the asynchronicity allows you to do things that aren't constrained by a timetable. You don't have to finish the class in 50 minutes deliberately because someone else is knocking on the door waiting to get in. And also there's a value to some of the anonymity. You may get different and varying levels of engagement, but actually that engagement can be, a perfectly valid passive experience, listening to and surveying other people's contributions. Being able to contribute at the right time under, as it were, your own name is what's going to tie into some of the assessment methods, certainly. But these are enablers. Students can see what other students are doing. That's a hugely empowering opportunity to be able to see. When you're just in one class at one point in time, actually you can't see what others are doing. And I think also this raises some interesting possibilities about some of the power relationships that are involved in this. And this is why I make mention of sort of decolonising our practice through this. I would immediately counter that by saying there are some sort of, as it were, neo-colonialising opportunities in terms of access to the facilities, Wi-Fi technology, but not alone in that. But I do think there's an opportunity here to recognise some of the accessibility issues, particularly for students with specific learning requirements, for students with physical disabilities, students who have strong caring responsibilities. All of these are elements that you can address through this. Mark, would you be kind enough to move forward? So what I would stress from the outset here is that these are principles that can be baked in and not bolted on to your enterprise. Make sure that we're able to address the value of online learning communities as part of your practice. In some senses, we would do this very readily in a campus experience, and it's just a matter of recognising it and utilising some of the affordances that we have. Mark. That said, it's also important not to be fixated by some of the technology. The appeal of a flashy piece of software, a new add-in, a plug-in or whatever can be very tempting, but it is important to recognise the agency of the learning experience in this. And I think that's not just so much invested in the tutor or the teacher, but in the whole community. So it is very much a flattening of the hierarchies that we've seen in higher education. Mark? So I'll provide a sort of example here, and particularly stressing the sort of multi-layered and multi-directional dimension. You can use, as many of you will be familiar with, Gilly Salmon's Tivity Framework, which again speaks to what Diane was talking about, having this purpose and the respond element, making sure that students are clear about how those empowering elements are part of it, and you can integrate it into assessment. So just as a slide, which I won't dwell on, but Mark, if you'd be so kind. So a little bit of the background, some of the pedagogic thinking that comes into this. Again, I won't dwell on this now, but simply to suggest that the learning community dimension through the scaffolding of Gilly's 5-stage model, students are encouraged to and engage at different levels at different times. So through the access and the motivation, which we've spoken about, creating incentives for students to engage, familiarising themselves through socialisation, and then moving towards the high level learning outcomes in knowledge construction, facilitating their own learning. And particularly the bar along the side there, reflecting the amount of interactivity that does do a sort of bell curve. It takes a while to get going, but then reaches a peak point as knowledge is constructed amongst students, and then perhaps drops a little as students complete their own individual tasks. Thank you, Mark. And so just as a very simple example of translating that, the access and socialization EPT, providing something that students can engage with right from the outset of their time with the course, providing very clear, consistent instruction, and reminding them that there is a respond element. It's not something they can go away and do on their own. They have to be able to engage with others. So here, looking at responding to at least 2 other people's posts. Now, in this instance, this is a very straightforward sort of icebreaker exercise. But the principles are something that you can then roll out through more structured alignment to the learning outcomes of any given subject. And this is whether you're working with half a dozen postgraduate students, or many, now hundreds of thousands of students that we've seen go through the MOOCs that we've been responsible for. And also to give a guideline, to provide something for a handhold for students, to provide a timeline estimation as well, I think is an important part of this, so that students don't feel overwhelmed by having to spend hours and hours doing this, but neither do they just glibly pass it by. And again, you're looking here at the time commitment that colleagues have. Colleagues cannot be expected to share, hours and hours of their time to this. So there's a mutual recognition of the importance of the temporal element here. Mark?
Simon, 1 minute to go. Is that okay?
Thank you. So I shall draw this to a close. And these are the sort of factors that I wanted to point to in terms of what makes for successful online learning communities. And I think the early and continued use of this, embedding it into one's practice, support via a cadre of associate tutors, that's colleagues who have another pivot point, to use the word of time. There's immediacy of contact, but not immediate. It's not 24/7 waiting on any given post. It's a matter of thinking about how you can establish a dialogue, and particularly some of the low value and summative assessments that this can contribute to, which are low risk for students in some senses, but they do act as confidence building measures in making sure that you're creating a peer support environment that prevents isolation and builds collegiality, which increases student performance, and creating incentives for students to do that. Students learn very quickly that if colleagues contribute, they are able to contribute more effectively, and ultimately their submissions are better. The short turnaround, so there is something of a time loop here that we need to keep to, and consistent feedback as much as anything else as a mechanism of feed forward, understanding that students will respond to that, but incorporating that into, as it were, the next series of exercises, and providing sort of multiple opportunities for feedback. The replication of the outside the tutorial room conversation, the 5 minutes on the way to a lecture, the office hour experience, which sometimes might be a little constrained, but nonetheless, all of these are points at which you can create those formative feedback points, which are important to online learning community enterprise. So I'll stop there and look forward to some questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks very much. So I particularly like the idea of utilising online communities. That seemed to me to echo some of what Diana was saying in her previous presentation, shifting the balance of the work, if you like, more towards the students working online. So what we're going to do now is take questions for Simon, but after that we're going to open up, we're going to return to Diana's presentation and a lot of questions that were being stacked up there that we didn't have time to address. So we'll take questions for Simon first, and then we'll return to the questions that were put forward to Diana, and of course any further questions that get prompted by the discussion as we go along. Jonathan San Diego unfortunately is not going to be able to join us this morning, but given the huge number of questions we've got racked up on screen here, I think we've still got plenty to talk about. So Gwyneth, can we have questions, please?
Yes, there's a question here. Do you think we should push students to participate online, or is listening only a legitimate mode of participation? So, for you, Simon.
Good question. I think we can encourage students, and I really point to incentivizing their participation rather than pushing them with a stick. It's providing them with a carrot. And by virtue of some of the structure, for example, in Salmon's Tivity model, where you have a response, students are, they cannot complete the exercise unless they've responded. So the incentive for them to engage is very clear. And also what Diane talked about is students actually can see the benefit of their engagement very clearly, in some senses more clearly than they can, through a campus-based experience where, they say something and someone else immediately jumps in and says something, or actually their assessment may get lost in was the tutor listening at that particular point. So I think the opportunity to engage with students, and particularly in setting good habits and managing expectations. So one of the key features of the courses that I've been involved with is making sure that students start off in that way of thinking, so that when they're engaged in talking around, you know, what's their favourite restaurant in a city or what have you, it not only builds up a quite useful travel guide on my behalf when we go to travel again, but also enables them to talk to each other, to recognise the value of hearing from, you know, not the sage on the stage, to use that phrase, but from each other. And therefore, there's not a question of forcing them to do anything. You know, in the thousands of students who I've had the pleasure of teaching online, you know, I've not had a single student come back to me and say, you know, this isn't the way I want to learn. They've seen the benefit of it right from the outset. Now, there's a number of, you know, predispositions about students coming to an online course in the first instance, which may not apply to students who are expecting a campus or continuing a campus-based experience. But I think we underestimate students' ability to be flexible in some instances, and I think that they can be sufficiently engaged that they're participating, you know, without being forced in that fashion.
Thanks, Simon.